Good morning. This is Grant Goulabon, Deputy State Director with Americans for Prosperity, Pennsylvania. And this morning, as part of our continuing efforts to educate the people of Pennsylvania about what's been going on with the constitutional ballot questions that are on the May ballot. As we speak right now, it's been a year roughly since Governor Tom Wolf issued his original emergency declaration dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And since that time, I've seen various orders coming from the governor and 4 90-day extensions of that declaration. And during that time, Pennsylvanians have had to contend with a very confusing and arbitrary mix of policy prescriptions from the governor, orders coming from his administration that have affected Pennsylvania's business community, affected the jobs of many Pennsylvania residents, affected the ability of Pennsylvania's children to be able to be provided a continuous education, affected our ability to gather in public and in private, and is really, again, affected every aspect of our lives. And during that time, Pennsylvanians, both directly to the governor and through the representatives in the General Assembly, have been trying to inform the process by which the governor makes his decisions throughout this emergency. But that has not been forthcoming in terms of much in the way of cooperation or flexibility from the governor as he has managed the pandemic response under his emergency powers. So with me today is Representative Seth Grove. He is chairman of the House State Government Committee and prime sponsor of the House version of a bill that recently passed as a Senate Bill 2 that provides for 2 constitutional amendments on the May ballot here in 2021 that deal with the governor's emergency powers. Representative Grove, thank you very, very much for joining me today. And wondered if, first of all, kind of to set the scene and get a little bit of background, I wondered if you've been intimately involved in the discussions about how the state is managing the pandemic through the Wolf administration response. But what's it been like to be a legislator throughout this time? And can you kind of shed some light on some of the internal discussions that people may not have been privy to in terms of trying to provide input as the pandemic response has been put forth by the Wolf administration?
Yeah, thanks, Grant, and really appreciate the partnership we've had with AFP here in Pennsylvania. What a great grassroots organization of people who deeply care about their country and want to make positive changes every single day. So that grassroots input and people calling their legislators of being active and engaged has been really a force multiplier in doing good things here in Pennsylvania. So I just want to first thank your organization for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. So going back a year, I'll give it some guidance. So when COVID-19, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, hit. It hit Europe first, and we as Americans saw what was happening, particularly in Italy. A lot of fatalities. We weren't sure of what was happening. So here in the United States, if you remember, it really started with the Ivy League schools. They shut down. And then it started this spiral effect of just stuff shutting down. And then we had the, 2 weeks, let's give it 2 weeks. Everybody just shut down 2 weeks, and then we'll see what happens. That 2 weeks lasted until, today's March 5th, 2021, and we're still under coronavirus orders. And every state handled it differently. Remember, the federal government did not dictate closures of anything. They didn't. The Trump administration did not close a single entity. They put out guidance. And it was governors in every single state that directed how they were going to mitigate the coronavirus and COVID-19 in their individual states. Here in Pennsylvania, it flowed basically. We had school closures. They started shutting down doing stay-at-home orders in counties, starting with the most populous. And then the governor went for the full enchilada, stay-at-home orders across the state. And then came the business closures, which was a travesty. Remember, he tried twice. He did a, Thursday at 5 o'clock announcement that Friday everything's closing, and then there was this big uproar. And then governor backed off and said, "Okay, I want you to start abiding by my orders, or we're really going to shut you down." So a few weeks later, he did it again. Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, he announced on Sunday every business in the Commonwealth will shut down except for a microscopic few. And then he realized that they couldn't do that because his staff didn't understand how the economy works. For instance, I have a paper manufacturing plant. My paper manufacturing plant could stay open, but they couldn't forest. They couldn't cut down trees. So I had a conversation. I'm like, listen, right? I'm like they're complete non-understanding of the supply chain, and it was industry after industry within the manufacturing. Like, oh, thanks for letting us stay open, but we don't have a supply chain because you just eviscerated it. It's just little stuff like that. So there was a big fight. I mean, it was, and it to be honest, it was Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats don't want to say it, but they sent in emails urging the governor to open businesses. Which they will not admit to, but we know it to be true. So there was a big internal battle. So the governor came up with his waiver process, and we all remember the waiver process. No real guidance. It was hodgepodge, and literally you could have competitors, one closed and one open. There wasn't really any random. There was really any guidance you could use. You just make the best argument you can. We're the only state, I believe, to shut down transportation infrastructure. We're the only state to not allow home sales. Like, for a guy that wants to fight poverty, if you were in the middle of a home sale, and listen, some people got stuck paying 2 mortgages because they couldn't, they bought the new house, couldn't sell their old house, couldn't finalize it. You're doing a double mortgage payment. That's a huge financial burden, but those were the results of his car dealerships. I'm from York County. People were going to other areas to buy cars because you couldn't buy a car here. If Carvana and all of those internet sales were operating, but the mom and pop car lots couldn't operate. That's what we were facing. It was horrific. So we started some reopening bills because we believed, and we still believe today, and we know it's true because we see the data of states from the most draconian states, which Pennsylvania is one of on the lockdowns, to the most freedom lockdown states. There's no data difference between the two. There really isn't. So whether you did or didn't lock down, the result was the same. The difference was the economic realities and the mental health results. Overdose, suicides, addiction climbed in Pennsylvania during that time. All the while we had, if you remember, we still were under, and we are still under, emergency declaration for opioids, which have expanded so much. But that is how the heavy burden, I mean, you talk about massive job loss. We have businesses that we have almost industries that don't even exist anymore in Pennsylvania because of the governor's lockdown. How do you recover from that? 30% of businesses gone. You can't recover from that kind of economic collapse. So that's the result. So there was beyond frustration in the General Assembly because it has been a go alone attitude of the governor up until a few weeks ago. So for a year, Governor Wolf was acting unilaterally on his own decor. We would pass bills to reopen an industry. He'd veto it. And then to make sure the Democrats didn't join us in doing veto overrides, he would go adopt a regulation. and it was all about power. Because he can't waive statute. So if we had a business reopen plan signed into law under statute, he couldn't waive it, and it removed his power to go after them. And one of the hardest hits was, and still is the restaurant industry, because he knew he could get them on their liquor license, because those liquor licenses are $300,000-$400,000. It's a huge expense. And when you look at a business owner and say, you will shut down and abide by this, or I'm with pulling your liquor license, it's not a lot of wiggle room. Like, that's a heavy burden. And he knew he had the Liquor Control Enforcement Agency to go do that on top of Ag and Department of Health. Restaurants have 3 agencies that do inspections and oversight on them. So it's a heavy regulated industry, and he knew he could get them to comply. And the mitigation didn't work. Through the data, through contact tracing, which again, we had to do right to know requests because they weren't sharing any data, absolutely no data. They weren't quantifying any decision with any study or science, nothing. It was, we're going to make it up as we go. And they have done an awful job of managing it. So under emergency declaration law, it was passed in 1970s. It was a model bill by CSG, and a lot of states have similar. Within that provision, it allows the governor to have a 90-day emergency declaration and basically extend it as well. There was a provision put in there that the General Assembly could stop any emergency declaration by passing a concurrent resolution of the House and Senate, and it would end. So we did that. Russ Diamond proposed House Resolution 863. We passed in the House, we passed in the Senate. And the governor took us to court because he vetoed it, and he said that we have a presentment clause in the Constitution, and he said that had to be presented to him through the normal regulatory process. And what we have a Supreme Court that was taken over by very liberal Democrats that have sided with the governor this entire time. Between all the lawsuits and the business closures, with other states, like there are state Supreme Court throughout a lot of these draconian shutdown policies over time. But our PA Supreme Court fully backed the governor the entire time. So we as a General Assembly have been doing everything we can with basically both hands tied behind our backs. We've put up the veto overrides. We've done everything we can. So we finally had enough. Senate Majority Leader Kim Ward last session introduced a constitutional amendment to change the emergency declaration to provide the checks and balances that have been enshrined in our Constitution since the founding of our state. So we did it last session. The constitutional amendment takes you have to pass the same exact language, 2 consecutive sessions, and then it goes to the voters at the next ballot or the next election, and they can vote on it. So we basically the first thing we did as state government chairman, one of the first bills I ran out of that committee was House Bill 55 because we have the timing. The May primary is coming in. There's a 90-day. We have to get it passed within 90 days. So we literally had until February 17th to get that bill passed in the House and the Senate. So we moved it. We were in first. We moved the House version. The Senate came in. They moved the Senate version. As soon as we got it, I moved it out of committee and we got it done. So the voters have the ability to vote on 3 very critical and important constitutional ballot questions. So that's the history, and people need to really think about this past year. When they go into that ballot, you need to think about everything that transpired. You need to think about the shutdowns, the closures, how that impacted you, your family, your children, your school, your loved ones. And then you need to make a very tough decision whether we think as a society that a governor, one person, should have unilateral power for the amount of time that they do. And by the way, this is it. If we don't have these constitutional amendments passed, there will be no checks and balances. We will be under this emergency declaration until the governor feels he is done and over with it. So it's
no, you couldn't have put it any better. And I don't think any fair-minded observer could say that the General Assembly and the people of Pennsylvania haven't done everything that they possibly can to try to work with the governor and provide input for the purposes of making the situation better economically, personally, for children and families, people being able to worship and gather for religious services. I mean, everything that possibly could be done to cooperate has been done. And as you said, the amendments are aimed at now ending this situation of zero checks and balances. Now, the two amendments that are on the ballot, the first of which deals with the length of time that a governor can have an emergency declaration in force without bringing it to the General Assembly for its approval or for its continuation. And the second deals with what kinds of emergencies the governor can then declare once an existing declaration is no longer in force. Can you describe a little bit about the content of the questions and their intention?
Yeah. So ballot question number one, and they're both critically important and they work together. So we absolutely need yes votes on both of those questions. Actually vote yes on all three, because all three are very important. And hopefully we can get into the third one too, because I think it goes right into where AFP is on a multitude of issues as well. But question one. So we go back to the emergency declaration that was passed in the 1970s. That law envisioned natural disasters, right? So flooding, hurricane, earthquake, something major as a natural disaster. You think about the Johnstown flood. That's what we're talking about when we talk about emergency declarations. No one envisioned health pandemic, and we've had health pandemics before. Never have we exercised this amount of power unilaterally in the executive branch, ever in the history of the United States, ever. So we go in there and that law provides 90 days. So emergency declaration go 90 days. That is the longest in the country. We have the longest allowance for emergency declaration in the country. We close that to 21 days. You got 3 weeks. That handles most of the emergencies we have seen. We can handle within that 3-week phase. And then so currently after that 90 days, the governor can reissue his order anytime he wants. There's no limit. So, we're under the third or fourth variation of that March 3rd original order on the coronavirus. Instead, this would say 21 days, and then you need to get approval from the General Assembly to move it forward. Now, they say, oh, the General Assembly, what if you can't meet? Like, we've been meeting the entire time. Actually, State Government Committee last session was the only legislative committee meeting for months on end. We were it. We were open. We figured out how to be open, and we've managed through it. I contracted COVID. My committee still met and did hearings because we have the next man up mantra, next man or woman up mantra. We know how important our role is. We know how important legislative oversight is. We know how important checks and balances are within our Constitution. And we came up with rules that allow us to continue to operate during this health pandemic to ensure that the people's voices are heard on these important public policy issues. So we've been capable of operating. Now, let's say there was a giant sinkhole in Harrisburg, went right underground. It wouldn't be the first time. So, our Capitol burned to the ground in the 1900s, 100 years. Yeah. So it wasn't like 100 years ago, the Capitol burned down. And obviously that's the seat of government where the General Assembly meets. We ended up meeting in a church, and we just celebrated that anniversary at the church. So we can meet. We just need to get some time to meet. And the whole point of having emergency declaration is to do a quick management of a situation and try to get things back to normal as quickly as you can. We in today's society are capable of doing that. Inherently, we could meet anywhere. So if we had flooding in Harrisburg, we could go meet in Philadelphia somewhere. We could meet in Pittsburgh. We can meet in State College. We can meet in Erie. We can meet wherever we need to make sure we have a functioning General Assembly. We're nimble enough and we're capable enough. So we don't need executive authority ruling our lives in and out and making every decision unilaterally. So we can absolutely function in that 21-day time frame. So I think it's important to pass that ballot question number one. Ballot question number two goes back to when I discussed on the emergency declaration ending the emergency. So we have a limit on how long it is in ballot question one. We have it can't be extended without the approval of the General Assembly. Now we have, what if he starts an emergency declaration and it is just, we don't need it, and it's proven, but he just wants to grab some power for a few weeks, right? Ballot question number two gives us the authority to end an emergency declaration prior to that 21-day point in time. So going back to that Russ Diamond resolution and that language in the emergency declaration that allows us to do a concurrent resolution to end emergency declaration, we basically create an exception to that presentment clause in the Constitution that says the governor doesn't need to sign resolutions. Concurrent resolutions, joint resolutions are not the domain of the governor anymore. It is an internal function of the General Assembly. We pass it, it's over and done with. So between those two constitutional amendments, we now bring in those very important checks and balances of unilateral executive overreach that we have seen in a multitude of states for the past year dealing with this pandemic.
I think that's an interesting point to make again, that it's not just Pennsylvania that's dealt with this, and that it isn't a partisan issue, because I know that there are other states where you've had a governor and the General Assembly of the same party where there's been conflict about the use of the governor's emergency powers and the ability of the legislature to be able to be involved in advising and not managing, but providing input. And not having it be a completely unilateral situation with no checks or balances.
I mean, it is every state is dealing this. When we were doing Senate Bill 2, my opening statement, I read through every single state that's discussing this right now. And it is all over the spectrum. It is Republican legislatures curbing power and Republican governors. It is Democrat legislators curbing power and Democratic governors. It is Democratic legislators curbing power and Republican governors. It's Republican legislators curbing power and Democratic governors. That is all nonpartisan. That is all within the role of government and trying to reprovide those checks and balances that were envisioned by our founders to ensure we don't have a king-type government structure. And that's what we've faced over this past year is unilateral decisions. And listen, we really did try. One of my bills I prime sponsored and we passed in the House last session was to create a coronavirus task force of bipartisan legislators meeting with the governor. Guess what happened this past week? Because the governor botched the vaccine rollout so bad, he finally created a legislative bipartisan task force, and lo and behold, we are now seeing tremendous improvements in our vaccine rollout. Little stuff like, hey, governor, how comes the little state of West Virginia has a 17% vaccination rate? What are they doing? Oh, they're using the National Guard. Hey, governor, how about we use the National Guard? Because there's something the military does really, really well. Logistics. You want logistics done? Those people can move mountains to literally, they've moved mountains to get their objectives completed. And that's what other states have done. And it's not that hard. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can see what other states are doing and doing well, and you repeat it. The problem with our governor is he's really liked to follow Governor Cuomo. That was his thing. Like, oh, Governor Cuomo, let's go follow his. And we've seen it with nursing homes. We've seen it with vaccine rollout. We've seen it across the board. Like the Cuomo plan for dealing with coronavirus was not the plan. The Governor DeSantis plan, that was a pretty darn good plan. I mean, He protected his seniors. He left his economy open, and they're better off for it today. I mean, even Greg Abbott and taxes. I mean, given they had a lot of issues with weather conditions this past week, but they managed it pretty well throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, I think overall, just in looking at the pandemic response and looking at the philosophy about the governor's emergency powers, it's a function of two competing worldviews. You mentioned the ability of the General Assembly to be able to do its job regardless of where it has to do that. You figure things out using the technology and what's available to you. So your approach and the General Assembly's approach in passing these amendments is that Pennsylvanians are resilient, they're intelligent, and they're capable of making good decisions based on the data and evidence available to them. The governor's view is exactly opposite that, and that's the competition we have here. One final thing that I wanted to ask you about. We've now seen the language that will be used for the ballot in May, and the Department of State, in wording the questions, I think did its best to try to influence the result in one particular direction. Can you talk a little bit about what they did in wording those questions and what the implications are as voters go to the polls?
Yeah, so when we do an amendment to the Constitution, it is ingrained in the legislative branch. The executive branch has no real role in that. Theirs is clerical. I'll call it clerical. I mean, literally, it's the job of the Department of State to get the question on the ballot. Plain language. Office of Attorney General kind of spells out the legal background of it. Generally, I think the Office of Attorney General, I think they did a fair job of explaining the law and how it's changed. But the Department of State, and you got to remember what we've dealt with in elections in Pennsylvania. We had a Department of State that manipulated guidance, and I'll give you one example. Within our state law on elections, there's a provision that allows counties to open up satellite offices. Now, a satellite office is literally that office satellite somewhere else to do paperwork and stuff, not a polling place, like a satellite office. Secretary Bookvar took that language and created the drop boxes. They created basically satellite polling places, really expanded that. So they took an inch and expanded it out. We took it to court. Court's basically said, no harm, no foul. Who cares? Clear violation. Like that language did not allow for any of that to happen, but they still pushed it. So we have that Department of State still there. And they took simple language and made it an op-ed, which violates years of procedure and protocol. So instead of just saying ballot question 1 shall only allow a governor's emergency declaration, allow 21 days, and the General Assembly after 21 days has to renew the emergency declaration. Instead of that, it adds this entire language of, do you really want the General Assembly to manage emergency declarations? It's going to curtail their power, or the governor's power, to swiftly deal with it. I mean, I've never seen an op-ed as a constitutional ballot, but they did it in both those questions. It is egregious. So we're now going to have to reform the ballot question and basically remove the executive branch completely from it. And it's a real shame, but that's the direction this Wolf administration has gone. It's all about politics and not about policy. They don't care about people. They care about their power. And that's clear. And you can see it for Washington, D.C. and H.R. 1. You can see it in their stimulus package. Everything the Democrats are doing right now is about controlling power and politics. Everything else and everybody else is second to them, and they will destroy whoever they want to reach their power objectives. And it's a real shame.
Yes. It's kind of breathtaking to go back and hear that entire history again. Again, thank you again so much for taking the time to join us today and to provide us with that invaluable background and perspective around why this is so important and why Pennsylvanians need to be well informed about what these amendments really do before they go out to the polls this spring. Representative Seth Grove, thank you so much. Look forward to talking with you and working with you more in the future. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.
Will do. Thank you too, Grant. Really appreciate it. And again, we really appreciate the work, the grassroots support work that AFP does every single day.
No, thank you. All right. Well, to everyone joining us today, thank you very much for being with us. This is Grant Goulabon, Deputy State Director with Americans for Prosperity, Pennsylvania. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe out there. Have a good day.